Legendary Passages, Episode 71, The Island of Atlantis. Atlantean Architecture, from Plato's Critias. Last time, we reviewed the ancient Athenians. This time, we explore the island city of Atlantis itself. Poseidon had 5 sets of twin sons with a mortal woman named Cleito, and their firstborn son was named Atlas, after whom Atlantis and the Atlantic Ocean was so named, and each successive firstborn son of his line became king. The island was rich in resources, chiefly in orichalcum, a glowing red metal more precious than gold. The ground was fertile, providing many plants and animals, including elephants. The city is measured in stadia, a unit of length about 185 meters. 607 feet, or just over 200 yards. On the island there were 3 rings of water nested inside each other, probably successive volcanic rims. The order goes like this: the Atlantic Ocean, the Island of Atlantis, the outer lake, the outer ring, the middle channel, the inner ring, the innermost moat, and finally the central island. Next time, we review the history of the kings of Atlantis. The Island of Atlantis, a legendary passage, from Plato's Critias, translated by Benjamin Jowett. Yet before proceeding further in the narrative, I ought to warn you that you must not be surprised if you should perhaps hear Hellenic names given to foreigners. I will tell you the reason of this. Solon, who was intending to use the tale for his poem, inquired into the meaning of the names and found that the early Egyptians in writing them down had translated them into their own language, and he recovered the meaning of the several names, and when copying them out again, translated them into our language. My great-grandfather, Dropides, had the original writing, which is still in my possession, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. Therefore, if you hear names such as are used in this country, you must not be surprised, for I have told you how they came to be introduced. The tale, which was of great length, began as follows. I have before remarked in speaking of the allotments of the gods, that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and made for themselves temples and instituted sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman, and settled them in a part of the island, which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but in the center of the whole island, there was a plain, which is said to have been the fairest of all plains and very fertile. Near the plain again, and also in the center of the island, at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain not very high on any side. In this mountain there dwelt one of the earth-born primeval men of that country, whose name was Evenor, and he had a wife, Leucippe, and they had an only daughter, who was called Cleito. The maiden had already reached womanhood when her father and mother died. Poseidon fell in love with her and had intercourse with her, and breaking the ground, enclosed the hill in which she dwelt all around, making alternate zones of sea and land larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant every way from the center, so that no man could get to the island, for ships and voyages were not as yet. He himself, being a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center island, bringing up 2 springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warm water and the other of cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly from the soil. He also begat and brought up 5 pairs of twin male children, and dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions, he gave to the firstborn of the eldest pair his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment, which was the largest and best, and making him king over the rest. The others he made princes, and gave them rule over many men and a large territory. And he named them all. The eldest, who was the first king, he named Atlas, and after him the whole island and the ocean were called Atlantic. To his twin brother, who was born after him, and obtained as his lot the extremity of the island toward the Pillars of Heracles, facing the country which is now called the region of Gades in that part of the world, he gave the name, which in the Hellenic language is Eumulus, and the language of that country which is named after him, Gadarus. Of the second pair of twins, he called one Ampheres, and the other Avamon. To the elder of the third pair of twins he gave the name Nesius, and Autochthon to the one who followed him. Of the fourth pair of twins he called the elder Elasippus, and the younger Mestor. And of the fifth pair he gave to the elder the name of Azais, and to the younger that of Diaprepes. All these and their descendants for many generations were the inhabitants and rulers of diverse islands in the open sea, and also, as has already been said, they held sway in our direction over the country within the Pillars as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Now Atlas had a numerous and honorable family, and they retained the kingdom, the eldest son handing it on to his eldest son for many generations. And they had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings and potentates, and is not likely ever to be again. And they were furnished with everything which they needed, both in the city and the country. For because of the greatness of their empire, many things were brought to them from foreign countries, and the island itself provided most of what was required by them for the uses of life. In the first place, they dug out of the earth whatever was to be found there, solid as well as fusile, and that which is now only a name, and was then something more than a name, orichalcum, was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, being more precious in those days than anything except gold. There was an abundance of wood for carpenter's work, and sufficient maintenance for tame and wild animals. Moreover, there was a great number of elephants in the island, for as there was provision for all other sorts of animals, both for those which live in lakes and marshes and rivers, and also for those which live in mountains and on plains, so there was for the animal which is the largest and most voracious of all. Also, whatever fragrant things there are now in the earth, whether roots or herbage, or woods, or essences which distill from fruit and flower, grew and thrived in that land. Also, the fruit which admits of cultivation, both the dry sort, which is given us for nourishment, and any other which we use for food, we call them all by the common name pulse. And the fruits having a hard rind, affording drinks and meats and ointments, and a good store of chestnuts and the like, which furnish pleasure and amusement, and are fruits which spoil with keeping, and the pleasant kinds of dessert, with which we console ourselves after dinner, when we are tired of eating. All these that sacred island, which then beheld the light of the sun, brought forth, fair and wondrous, and in infinite abundance. With such blessings the earth freely furnished men. Meanwhile, they went on constructing their temples and palaces and harbors and docks, and they arranged the whole country in the following manner. First of all, they bridged over the zones of the sea which surrounded the ancient metropolis, making a road to and from the royal palace. And at the very beginning, they built the palace in the habitation of the god and of their ancestors, which they continued to ornament in successive generations, every king surpassing the one who went before him to the utmost of his power, until they made the building a marvel to behold for size and for beauty. And beginning from the sea, they bored a canal of 300 feet in width, and 100 feet in depth, and 50 stadia in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone, making a passage from the sea to this, which became a harbor, and leaving an opening sufficient to enable the largest vessels to find ingress. Moreover, they divided at the bridges the zones of land which parted the zones of sea, leaving room for a single trireme to pass out of one zone into another. And they covered over the channels so as to leave a way underneath for the ships, for the banks were raised considerably above the water. Now the largest of the zones, into which a passage was cut from the sea, was 3 stadia in breadth, and the zone of land, which came next, of equal breadth. But the next 2 zones, the one of water, the other of land, were 2 stadia. and the one which surrounded the central island was a stadium only in width. The island in which the palace was situated had a diameter of 5 stadia. This included the zones and the bridge, which was the 6th part of a stadium in width. They surrounded by a stone wall on every side, placing towers and gates on the bridges where the sea passed in. The stone which was used in the work they quarried from underneath the center island and from underneath the zones, on the outer as well as the inner side. One kind was white, another black, and a third red, and as they quarried, they at the same time hollowed out double docks, having roofs formed out of the native rock. Some of their buildings were simple, but in others they put together different stones, varying the color to please the eye, and to be a natural source of delight. The entire circuit of the wall, which went round the outermost zone, they covered with a coating of brass, and the circuit of the next wall they coated with tin, and the third, which encompassed the citadel, flashed with the red light of orichalcum. The palaces in the interior of the citadel were constructed on this wise. In the center was a holy temple dedicated to Cleito and Poseidon, which remained inaccessible, and was surrounded by an enclosure of gold. This was the spot where the family of the 10 princes first saw the light, and thither the people annually brought the fruits of the earth in their season from all of the 10 portions, to be an offering to each of the 10. Here was Poseidon's own temple, which was a stadium in length, and half a stadium in width, and of a proportionate height, having a strange barbaric appearance. All the outside of the temple, with the exception of the pinnacles, they covered with silver, and the pinnacles with gold. In the interior of the temple, the roof was of ivory, curiously wrought everywhere with gold and silver and orichalcum, and all the other parts, the walls and pillars and floor, they coated with orichalcum. In the temple they placed statues of gold. There was the god himself standing in a chariot, the charioteer of 6 winged horses, and of such a size that he touched the roof of the building with his head. Around him there were 100 nereids riding on dolphins, for such was thought to be the number of them by the men in those days. There were also in the interior of the temple other images which had been dedicated by private persons. Around the temple on the outside were placed statues of gold of all the descendants of the 10 kings and of their wives, and there were many other great offerings of kings and of private persons, coming both from the city itself and from the foreign cities over which they held sway. There was an altar too, which in size and workmanship corresponded to this magnificence, and the palaces in like manner answered to the greatness of the kingdom and the glory of the temple. In the next place they had fountains, one of cold and another of hot water, in gracious plenty flowing, and they were wonderfully adapted for use by reason of the pleasantness and excellence of their waters. They constructed buildings about them and planted suitable trees. Also they made cisterns, some open to the heavens, others roofed over, to be used in winter as warm baths. There were the king's baths, and the baths of private persons, which were kept apart, and there were separate baths for women, and for horses and cattle, and to each of them they gave as much adornment as was suitable. Of the water which ran off they carried some to the grove of Poseidon, where were growing all manners of trees of wonderful height and beauty, owing to the excellence of the soil, while the remainder was conveyed by aqueducts along the bridges to the outer circles. And there were many temples built and dedicated to many gods, also gardens and places of exercise, some for men and others for horses, in both of the 2 islands formed by the zones. And in the center of the larger of the 2, there was set apart a racecourse of a stadium in width, and in length allowed to extend all around the island, for horses to race in. There were also guardhouses at intervals for the guards, the more trusted of whom were appointed to keep watch in the lesser zone, which was near the Acropolis, while the most trusted of all had houses given them within the citadel, near the persons of the kings. The docks were full of triremes and of naval stores, and all things were quite ready for use. Enough of the plan of the royal palace. Leaving the palace and passing out across the 3, you came to a wall which began at the sea and went all around. This was everywhere distant 5 stadia from the largest zone or harbor, and enclosed the whole, and the ends meeting at the mouth of the channel which led to the sea. The entire area was densely crowded with habitations, and the canal and the largest of the harbors were full of vessels and merchants coming from all parts, who, from their numbers, kept up a multitudinous sound of human voices, and din and clatter of all sorts, night and day.